Thank you for coming to this presentation. I'm presenting our research on mainland Chinese video game players. In particular, we're focusing on a potentially harmful quasi-gambling randomized monetization method found in video games, commonly known as loot boxes. Over the last 3 years, loot boxes have faced public controversy and scrutiny by regulators across the world due to loot boxes' similarity with gambling. The UK government, for example, is currently considering whether to regulate these mechanics. China has been one of the first countries to regulate loot boxes. We examined how mainland Chinese players engage with these mechanics and how that differs from how players in Western countries engage with these mechanics. So what are loot boxes? Loot boxes are virtual consumable items in video games that can be opened by players to obtain randomized rewards of variable in-game and real-world value. They can take on many different virtual forms, such as treasure chests, card packs, prize wheels, or gacha. Our research focuses on paid loot boxes that require money to buy. These are seemingly more harmful as they can directly cause overspending of real money by players. Some games allow for player trading, enabling loot box rewards to be transferred between players. These systems may enable players to sell in-game items for real-world money. This means that these loot box rewards gain real-world monetary value. What can loot box rewards do? Some rewards are just cosmetic. For example, they may make your sword glow green instead of red, or give you gold rather than silver armor, without any increase in power. Other rewards actually influence gameplay. For example, they could unlock additional content or give the player a competitive advantage over other players, such as more powerful weapons that can more easily defeat enemies. This means that players who paid for loot boxes can become stronger than other players, thus potentially encouraging these other players to also buy loot boxes so that they can compete on a more equal footing. This may create a stronger incentive to buy loot boxes which give a competitive advantage than those which are merely cosmetic. How much do people spend on loot boxes? We don't have conclusive data on worldwide loot box spending because this data is held by game companies, and they don't release their loot box sales data to the public. However, through publicly available data in China, we have been able to figure out that just one single game generates a daily revenue of over $500,000 in China alone. Player trading of in-game items is also substantial, with the virtual items of just 3 Steam games having been transacted 1.45 billion times between players with an aggregated value of over $1 billion. Extreme cases of individual players' loot box spending have been reported in mainstream media, such as one UK player spending nearly £700 in 1 month. Another player spent over $10,000 in just 2 years on the loot boxes of one single game. The BBC also reported in 2019 on a case where 4 children spent nearly £550 of their father's money on loot boxes without permission and still didn't get the rare item that they were after. What are the potential harms of loot boxes? The first potential harm of loot boxes is their structural similarities to gambling. They both involve the player or gambler paying an amount of money with the hope of obtaining more money or something more valuable through a randomized process. Secondly, empirical evidence has consistently established that there is a relationship between loot box spending and problem gambling. Specifically, that the more severe that participants' problem gambling was, the more money they spent on loot boxes. I note, however, that we do not yet know if loot boxes cause people to become problem gamblers, or if people who are already problem gamblers are more likely to spend a lot of money on loot boxes. Thirdly, loot boxes may abuse our natural, irrational decision-making biases, causing players to spend more money than they had originally intended. These decision-making biases have been experimentally demonstrated to cause overspending in the context of gambling, and so may also be applicable to the loot box context. Some research on loot box prevalence has already been conducted. Loot boxes have become prevalent across all major video gaming platforms. We are particularly concerned about children and other vulnerable groups being exposed to loot boxes. The UK Gambling Commission has found that 22.9% of UK 11 to 16-year-olds have paid real money to buy loot boxes. Regulators around the world are considering whether or not to regulate loot boxes because of their potential harms and because of how easily children can have access to them. This is why the regulation of loot boxes is a global consumer protection challenge. However, the existing literature has focused only on Western samples and the experience of players from Western countries. For example, yes, the correlation between loot box purchasing and problem gambling severity mentioned earlier has been consistently replicated. However, those replications took place using only Western samples. We know from prior cross-cultural studies of multiple Western countries that the strength of this relationship is weaker in some countries than in other countries. This relationship could be weaker or stronger in non-Western countries, or the relationship might not even exist because of inherent differences. For example, we know that national video game markets in various countries can be structurally very different. Our research on the prevalence of loot boxes in China found that 91% of the highest grossing iPhone games contained loot boxes, and that this was significantly higher than the 59% found in the UK. We also found that 90.5% of games deemed suitable for children aged 12 plus in China contained loot boxes, compared to 58.9% in the UK, which was significantly lower. In addition to structural differences in the video game markets, how gambling is regulated is also different. The only form of legal gambling in China is the lotteries, whilst in Western countries, the legalization of gambling has led to a proliferation of different types of legal gambling, from sports betting to slot machines, from casino games to easily accessible gambling apps on mobile phones. This means that Chinese video game players have significantly less access to legalized gambling than video game players in Western countries do. Additionally, China and the West also differs in terms of loot box regulation. In China, some degree of consumer protection is provided in relation to loot boxes by the Ministry of Culture's legal requirement for game companies to disclose the probabilities of obtaining randomized rewards. In contrast, loot boxes are generally unregulated in the West, although I note that two specific countries, Belgium and the Netherlands, have imposed loot box regulation. This means that players in China may be making more informed loot box purchasing decisions than players in Western countries because Chinese players are aware of how likely or unlikely they are to obtain the rewards that they want and how much on average it would cost them to do so. Given so many differences between China and Western countries, it must be asked whether the same relationship between loot box purchasing and problem gambling would replicate in non-Western countries such as China. Our study was a cross-sectional survey that participants self-selected into participating, so the usual disclaimers apply. We advertised on online video gaming forums and received 879 effective responses. Participants were predominantly young male students. This is not surprising, given that similar previous studies in Western countries using similar methodologies also recruited nearly 90% male participants. We measured four main things. Firstly, how much money the participants spend on loot boxes in the past 12 months. Secondly, we asked about passive gambling participation. And thirdly, for those participants who did report participating in gambling, we measured their problem gambling severity using the Problem Gambling Severity Index. Fourthly, we measured the impulsiveness of all participants. We pre-registered our hypothesis that we will find positive correlations between loot box spending and problem gambling severity, between loot box spending and passive gambling participation, and between loot box spending and impulsiveness. As to hypothesis 1, the positive correlation between loot box spending and problem gambling severity. When we tried to replicate this same correlation in China, we failed. Our failure to replicate could be due to a variety of reasons, including cultural differences, or that loot box spending may only be correlated with more gamified gambling activities, such as slot machine mobile apps, which are illegal in China. This failure could also be due to methodological reasons. Previous studies gave the problem gambling severity assessment scale to all participants, including participants who never gambled. This may have caused a degree of nuisance reporting that exaggerated the effect. More research needs to be done on this, because if this relationship does not exist in non-Western countries, then there is less justification for regulating loot boxes. As to hypothesis 2, the positive correlation between loot box spending and passive gambling participation, we found a very weak positive correlation in China that is likely not clinically significant. As to hypothesis 3, the positive correlation between loot box spending and impulsiveness, we again found a very weak positive correlation in China that is likely not clinically significant. Overall, there appears to be a weaker relationship between gambling and loot boxes in China than there is in Western countries. Why was it necessary to find out whether this relationship will replicate? This is because this relationship has been relied upon by policymakers and regulators to justify needing to regulate loot boxes. If this relationship does not exist in a country, the argument for regulating the mechanic in that country becomes weaker. We know that both developed and developing countries, Western and non-Western, across the world are considering regulating loot boxes. It would be inappropriate for the Western literature to be assumed to be applicable to players in, for example, Brazil, without further research. It would be wrong to impose restrictions on individual freedom on the basis of research that will not be replicable to the population that the restrictions are intended to apply to. Our research in China only represents a first step to better understanding this issue. In addition to attempting to replicate the relationship between loot box purchasing and problem gambling severity, we also examined other aspects of how video game players in China engage with loot boxes. As I mentioned before, China uniquely legally requires video game companies to disclose the probabilities of obtaining randomized rewards from loot boxes as a consumer protection measure. Here are two screenshots to demonstrate what loot box probability disclosure means. In the example on the left, we can see that if we bought this loot box, we would have a 5% chance of obtaining a reward of 5-star rarity. In the example on the right, we can see probabilities disclosed for specific items. For example, a player has a 1% chance of obtaining Mario. Our previous research has found that probability disclosures are often implemented in manners that are difficult for players to access. For example, in this game, players had to follow multiple hyperlinks, as shown on the screenshots. The players would be redirected to multiple pages, and then they have to do some scrolling to access the disclosure. Not all players may end up completing all these steps, and therefore not all players may be able to actually see the disclosures. So we took the opportunity of this survey to also ask our participants whether they have seen probability disclosures in games that they play. Of 428 participants who self-reported having purchased loot boxes in the past 12 months, 84.6% reported having seen probability disclosures. This reflects that most loot box purchasers have in fact seen disclosures despite them being implemented through suboptimal methods. This is contrary to our predictions in our previous research. Does seeing the disclosure reduce spending? To answer this, we asked whether players bought fewer loot boxes and spent less money after seeing probability disclosures. 72.4% of participants reported that their loot box purchasing behavior has not been affected by probability disclosures. 19.3% reported buying fewer loot boxes and spending less money, and 8.3% reported buying more loot boxes. Now, what does these survey results tell us? Taken together, of all 428 loot box purchases, only 16.4% reported buying fewer loot boxes and spending less money after seeing probability disclosures. This suggests that even if loot box probability disclosures are implemented prominently, their effectiveness at reducing spending is limited. A more interventionist measure may be necessary to effectively reduce spending and minimize harm. Regulators should consider stronger measures, such as imposing maximum spending limits to ensure consumer protection. We know that many policymakers and regulators outside of China are currently considering whether or not to copy the Chinese law. Our result suggests that copying those laws may not be sufficient at providing consumer protection to video game players. Thank you for listening. I will now take some questions. If you have any further questions after the Q&A session, or if you are not listening to this presentation live, please do get in touch with us using any of these methods.